So we are now recording, and I'm going to hand over to our speaker, Gianfranco Polizzi.
Thank you very much, Julian. It's really lovely to be here today and to be sharing some of the most important insights that have sort of emerged from different projects that I've recently kind of worked on with you, with your students, and with other colleagues and people from outside Portsmouth University as well. So a big concept that I have used in my work throughout the last few years is digital literacy, and it is a concept that can be applied to different things, if you will, and it also, overlaps with related concepts like digital resilience, digital citizenship. And what I'd like to do today is to really talk you through some of the key findings of 3 projects that we recently conducted at the University of Liverpool. Digital literacy is kind of a common denominator, if you will, cuts through all of these projects, even though these projects are actually different. The first piece of research that I'd like to tell you about is the minimum digital living standard. Like Julian is saying, this is a massive piece of work that was funded by Nuffield. We're now working on a Scottish version of the MDLS, but we did a massive piece of work across the UK. And I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but this really focuses on kind of the UK population as a whole and what it means to be digitally included, with a focus on households with children specifically. Then, after kind of giving you a little bit of an overview of kind of what's going on in terms of digital inclusion at a UK level, I'd like to focus more specifically on 2 populations which can be considered vulnerable for different reasons. On the one hand, we have survivors of modern slavery. There was this piece of work that we also recently conducted at the University of Liverpool, looking specifically at the needs of survivors of modern slavery, people that have, been subjected to forms of exploitation, labor, sexual exploitation, and what digital technologies mean to them with a view to reintegrating into the UK society. And then NewsWise. So we know that children tend to be not just the pioneers of using these digital technologies, but they often are also the most vulnerable users, really, because they are the first users that encounter online harms, and because, of course, online risks and harms can really affect their well-being in multiple ways. It is imperative, therefore, to develop their digital literacy. A project that I recently was involved in co-leading is the evaluation of NewsWise, school program delivered by the Guardian Foundation, and this program aimed to develop children's levels of news digital literacy in the UK. And as part of the evaluation, we also looked at the relationship between children's news literacy and their civic engagement. So, minimum digital living standard. So this, as I said, was a big piece of research that started from the decision to look at digital inclusion in a different way, in a novel way, if you will, because so far, if you look at instruments in the literature, they tend to be generally quite individualistic. They tend to focus on users, what the individual user needs. What we did was to focus on the household and try and look at digital inclusion at household level, which is why this is already in itself quite novel. But also, and probably more importantly even, is the fact that we, in order to develop an instrument, this instrument, which kind of it serves as a benchmark that spells out what is the minimum that people, and I'm talking here specifically about families with children, need in order to be digitally included. What is it that they need? This instrument was developed in consultation with members of the public. So this is not an instrument that was designed by experts and practitioners and academics who think this is what people need. But we actually asked people themselves. We asked families and different subsets of the population in the UK And that allowed us to basically create a definition of the minimum digital living standard, which I will read out in a minute. This was done through 4 different stages. And as part of this work, not only did we develop a definition of what the MDLS, the minimum digital living standard, means, but we also created a list of specific items that really tap onto the different dimensions of the MDLS. So after conducting a number of deliberative focus groups with subsets of the population, what we did was to design and administer a big survey to a nationally representative sample of UK households with children. And I will give you some key, I will share with you some key results from the survey, really to understand. So, this is the MDLS, this is what we've developed in consultation with members of the public. Now, we developed a survey and we were eager to understand the extent to which families with children fall above or below the MDLS. So, and in addition to that, we also did some stakeholder sessions, some workshops, basically with stakeholder organizations, politicians, practitioners, people interested in promoting digital inclusion. Therefore, focusing not just on the deployment of a new instrument for research purposes, but really on the practical and policy implications of the MDLS. We also conducted extra work in Wales, and as I said, we're currently doing research in Scotland. This was just to give you a sense of some of the limitations of the existing measures of digital inequality. As I said, they tend to focus on the individual. We also know, obviously, to put this in context, we know that there are differences, not just in digital access, but also digital literacy and digital skills. And you will see in a minute that indeed the main dimensions of the MDLS are 3, and they include digital access, digital equipment, and then digital literacy. Indeed, we know that the digital divide has been conceptualized and operationalized in ways that involve different levels, from access to devices, but we know that that is not enough, and we know that digital literacy plays an important key role. And what has emerged from this work, which is something we know already from media and digital literacy research, is that digital literacy indeed incorporates 2 dimensions, if you will, a functional, so the functional practical skills that people need in order to do stuff with these technologies, and more importantly, the critical thinking element of digital literacy, which has to do with understanding and knowing how to navigate and cope with online risks and harms, and with a view to participating in society. So I'm just going to skip this one and go straight into the definition of the MDLS. So this is the definition that was agreed with and by members of the UK public. A minimum digital living standard includes having accessible internet, adequate equipment, and the skills and knowledge that people need. So as you can see, those 3 dimensions indeed are here. And we have at the very bottom of the house on the right side of the screen, you can see we have devices and connections. So we have access, digital access, and digital equipment. And then we have 2 dimensions for digital literacy, the functional skills and the critical skills. Just to say that this is just a definition. The definition also is twofold, 2-part, because as it is clarified at the bottom, a minimum digital living standard is about being able to communicate, connect, and engage with opportunities safely and with confidence. So this is, this second part of the definition really spells out why it is important that people have digital access and functional and critical skills. As I said, the definition is also accompanied by a very specific and comprehensive list of items that really spell out what kind of equipment, what kind of specs digital devices should have, and what kind of functional and critical skills people need in a household. And by people, I mean both adults, parents, carers, guardians, and also children. So why was this an important piece of work? Because, as I said, it's bottom up. It really is really grounded in what people think. It's holistic. It's very comprehensive. It's not just about digital access, but it's also about digital literacy, and digital literacy in itself as functional and critical. Some of the key findings that emerged from this work. Well, some of the key findings that emerge from this work are alarming, but they also really resonate with other pieces of work and research that really, unfortunately, show that when we look at digital inclusion, again, comprehensive, holistically, going beyond the extent to which people have access or not to, broadband and in the internet, or have digital devices. And we still know that there are gaps and issues even with that. But if we are accounting also for digital literacy, and especially the critical aspects of digital literacy, then unfortunately, what emerged from our big survey is that 4 in 10 households with children are below the MDLS. So when you account for all of those 3 dimensions, unfortunately, 4 in 10 households do not meet the MDLS. Something else that also really emerged clearly from our work is that issues of poverty and social inequalities are very much intertwined with issues of digital exclusion. I will say more of that in a minute. So. Yeah, as I said before, these are the 3 key dimensions. And during those deliberative groups, people really spelled out what kind of devices, what kind of functional skills, what kind of critical skills. So if you want to know more, please take a look at the report that came out not long ago. But just to give a bit of a flavor of what, for example, digital access and equipment looks like, we have a list of specific items, and more promisingly, 81% of households fully meet the MDLS when it comes to digital access and equipment. But when we go into functional skills, already we can see that there are some other gaps that emerge. In as much as we have a clear list of skills that people in the UK think are vital in order to be able to be digitally included. I should clarify that when we're looking at at this list of skills or digital or equipment and devices, this is not to say that this is these items basically show what we would like everybody to have in order to be able to to thrive in the digital age. This is the bare minimum, and that's an important point to make. This list of items in terms of skills and equipment and devices really represents the bare minimum that people need to have in order to be able to be digitally included. And then we have the critical skills. As you can see, the critical skills, whereas the functional skills are more about obviously using these technologies, knowing how to operate these technologies, and doing practical things. The critical skills are, there are 3 sort of sub dimensions, if you will. They're about sharing and receiving information, obviously evaluating the quality of information, issues like disinformation, and we know that's a critical aspect of media and digital literacy, but also understanding digital footprint, understanding the privacy implications of data collection. And then there's also skills that have to do with interacting with others, identifying risks in general, and then really managing security. So, safety really did stand out as a very important aspect that relates to the critical skills that people think, both parents, but also their children really need to be able to possess in this day and age. And unfortunately, it is precisely when accounting for the critical skills that the percentage of households with children meeting the MDLS drops. We obviously collected also a lot of information, demographic information about the families, and as I said before, it's not surprising that there are a lot of links between social inequalities and poverty and digital exclusion. So So, for example, we know that single-parent household with one child living in an area of relative affluence in Southeast England may be four and a half times more likely to meet the MDLS than a single-parent household with more than two children living in an area of higher multiple deprivation in Northeast England, where the parent has also a long-term health issue. Equally, we also know, for example, that a dual-parent household, social grade AB, with two children working and living in a small town in Wales, may be 5.1 times more likely to meet the MDLS than a dual-parent household, social grade DE, with two children working by receiving benefits where parents identify as non-white and living in a small town in Wales. As I said, you know, these are the results. Again, these are the results that really emerge from the regression analysis that we conducted. You know, single parents are 1.3 times less likely to meet the MDLS than dual parent households. We also, you know from this research that households with more than two children are 1.68 times less likely to meet the MDLS than those with two or less children. And yeah, and perhaps the last one, I'll read the last one, the third. Households where the respondent identified as ethnically non-white are 2 times less likely to meet the MDLS than those where the respondent identified as white. So you can take a look at the report if you really are interested in the practical policy implications. We do a good job in that report of really spelling out the different roles and responsibilities of different actors and stakeholders. But here, maybe just to give you a flavor of that, you know, some of the key headlines are that it's important to recognize digital access is essential for families, but also, you know, make digital inclusion across cutting government priority for families. So really make sure that, you know, it's higher on the agendas of policymakers, and that it's not an afterthought. That, you know, that find ways to enable more families to afford suitable connectivity, but it's not just about, obviously, digital access and connectivity. It's very much also about skills and training, and, you know, and it's about catering for the needs of like adult populations through forms of digital training, but it's also very much about ensuring that digital literacy is firmly embedded in the school curriculum. So this was just a snapshot really of the MDLS, because as I said, it's a much more complex, you know, I hope I'm doing justice to it, but it's a very complex piece of research, and there's a great report out there if you're interested. As I said earlier, so the MDLS and findings from the MDLS project can give you a little bit of an indication of what digital exclusion looks like at, you know, in the UK when thinking about, you know, the broader population. Now I'd like to kind of just really focus on two specific populations. Let's start with survivors of modern slavery. So a population that it can be considered vulnerable for a lot of reasons, in a lot of ways. We conducted this piece of work that was funded by the MSPEC, and we basically looked at the ways in which survivors use digital technologies to reintegrate into UK society, and to also look at the kind of digital support that they receive. A little bit of context, first of all. This was a project, obviously, that, positioned survivors, again, people that, you know, have experienced forms of exploitation, like sexual labor exploitation, in ways that are grounded in concepts of intersectionality, obviously, in as much as there are really multiple layers of vulnerabilities that intersect. And obviously digital inclusion research, digital inequalities research. There is limited research on the digital experiences of survivors. What we mainly have in terms of research that has been conducted in the literature, you have studies that have looked primarily at patterns of trafficking and how exploitation can be prevented. We have published not just a report, but there's also like an academic paper that has just been published in the Journal of Human Trafficking. So if you're interested in kind of reading more about this piece of work, please take a look at those papers. And, you know, in this digital by default society in which we live, you know, it's really important to try and understand the gaps and the needs that survivors of modern slavery have in terms of, you know, their use of digital technologies, because that is going to be crucial to their ability to recover and reintegrate into UK society. So with this project, we basically we explored survivors' use of digital technologies during the process of reintegration and gaining independence, right? So there is an important framework in the UK, which is called the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, which is a framework that is designed to allow and to help survivors to reintegrate into society. It involves a lot of different stakeholders, like, you know, organizations, civil society organizations that provide support. So what we did was to, you know, to look at the digital experiences of survivors, their struggles in terms of reintegration, and we also interviewed representatives of organizations, really to try and understand the kind of support that is provided to survivors and the kind of challenges that exist in terms of provision of that support. So the research, in terms of research questions, we were interested in understanding how organizations that support survivors across the UK do so through digital technologies, but also what are the benefits and downsides of using these technologies for survivors of modern slavery. And then how do survivors of modern slavery use these technologies, both in general and in order to access and receive support. We conducted semi-structured interviews with representatives of organizations. We then asked also those organizations to review findings, preliminary findings, and we then conducted semi-structured interviews with survivors themselves. Key findings that really stood out from this project have to do with, you know, four main themes, if you will. One has to do with provision of you know, technology, of devices is inconsistent, and the funding behind it is limited, short-term, and inconsistent. There was a lot more happening during COVID, because obviously that's when a lot of these services and support services shifted online. But, you know, there were a lot of concerns from organizations around the extent to which that kind of funding is no longer necessarily available, or is not as consistent as it used to be. There are also issues in terms of digital support and the training that survivors need in order to develop the digital skills that they need in order to use these technologies. You know, again, there's a bit of a lack of consistency, particularly in relation to providing not just structured, but also individualized opportunities for developing digital skills. And those digital skills are very important, and they are very important. And this is something that emerged, especially from the interviews with survivors, not just for their own, you know, individualistic engagement with these technologies, and for you know, and in order to undertake essential tasks, such as, you know, accessing support services, you know, legal advice, health support, but also to really connect with others, to be able to communicate with family and friends, to be able to, you know, basically identify different communities and support groups, and really improve the social connectedness of survivors, which is obviously essential to their reintegration into society. At the same time, though, as we all know, these technologies present not just opportunities, but also considerable risks. And those risks are even heightened for a group like survivors of modern slavery, because, for example, there's a potential of you know, of using these technologies that can lead to issues of re-trafficking, as in perpetrators, you know, identifying, finding survivors, and then using digital technologies to get in touch with them. This is just an example, and which makes it even more imperative that, you know, better forms of training, digital skills training, with a component, with a focus on digital safety, really are provided for survivors. These are some of the quotations. It's interesting to see, you know, that, you know, some survivors, for example, said The internet helps me a lot. Without the internet, I wouldn't even be able to learn the language, which is already a very big barrier socially. This resonates with what I was saying before about intersectionality, right? And then we have quotes here showing also, how, for example, attending, digital skills training can be very helpful, but at the same time, some survivors will also learn more informally, for example, through their own children who may be more savvy than themselves when it comes to using these technologies. Some of the recommendations that we provided, the MSPAC, which stands for Modern Slavery Center, Research Evidence Center, is that more consistent, long-term, well-funded provision of digital support is crucial. That we need more and clearer guidance on how to develop digital literacy training programs for survivors, and the suitable technology packages for survivors, including a minimum number of devices or data, are really needed as part of the national referral mechanism. I'm going to move on to now the last project that I'd like to discuss now with you, which is NewsWise. So NewsWise is a project that I recently myself co-led. I co-led the evaluation of this project that ended just not long ago. NewsWise is basically a school program that was developed by the Guardian Foundation together with the PSHE Association and the National Literacy Trust. It's a school program that was designed to develop children's news / digital literacy, I would say, and I'm going to explain that. I'm going to explain why that in a minute. It really focuses on primary school children aged 9 to 11, so young children, we evaluated the second iteration of this project just not long ago. Why do I say news / digital? Because in this day and age, children are not going to open a newspaper. I mean, they might, but it's quite unlikely. We know very well that children will access news stories and information more broadly in ways that are highly mediated by digital technologies, which is why the key skills and competences that are crucial to concepts like news literacy inevitably overlap with concepts like digital literacy, which in itself can be understood really very much as a subset, if you will, of media literacy. Many people, including myself, tend to approach media literacy as an umbrella term, like an overarching term. So we know from a little bit of background, we know from the literature that engagement with news is crucial to the civic engagement of a well-informed citizenry. We know that democracy relies on a well-informed citizenry. People are expected to make decisions, and I'm not just talking here about voting, which ultimately is a very important form of political participation, but any aspect of civic, public, political, community life is mediated by decisions that people will make, and access to news that is trustworthy is essential to forming an informed opinion about anything, really. Unfortunately, though, we know from Ofcom and from other pieces of research that have been conducted that many in the UK, and not just adults, but especially children and young children as well, they often lack the critical skills the critical skills that are required to engage more safely with and critically with information. Ofcom found in 2023 that that 3 in 10 children believe all or most of what they see on social media to be true, and children also tend to be overconfident, and adults as well in a lot of ways, but tend to be overconfident about their own ability to identify fake news online. And this is an important finding because Ofcom use performance measures to not just rely on self-reporting, but also really to test participants' ability to spot misinformation. When it comes to the literature on news literacy specifically, there is oftentimes a focus on the relationship between news literacy and civic engagement, and the link is quite obvious in a way, right? Because people need to engage with the news. Being civically engaged does incorporate a dimension that has to do with consuming news, engaging with news. And there have been some studies that have been conducted on news literacy and the effectiveness of news literacy programs in schools, and they focused on young people specifically, older groups, like secondary school students, and the effectiveness of these programs in increasing their ability to spot misinformation, to understand the news ecology, and also on the relationship between news literacy and civic engagement. However, research has been quite limited. And it has mainly focused on the US, on the United States, on secondary school students, and there was, prior to conducting NewsWise, the evaluation of NewsWise, a lack of reliable instruments really for younger children. So there really were not many instruments designed and validated precisely to measure news literacy and civic engagement among young children. And most instruments did not incorporate any performance measures anyway, and they tend to rely primarily on self-reporting. So the research questions that really underpin the kind of the NewsWise evaluation, were how can news literacy and civic engagement be measured? And this is why we basically created a new instrument specifically to measure civic engagement and news literacy in 9 to 11-year-olds. There is a great report out there if you're interested to know more about these instruments and about the findings in general, but also a paper has already come out, an academic article in the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment, which really presents the civic engagement measure that we created. And I should say that the news literacy measure that we created does also incorporate a performance test. So it's not based entirely on self-reporting, but there's also the element of really ascertaining, pupils' ability to spot misinformation based on a test. What are 9 to 11-year-old self-reported levels of news literacy and civic engagement? And then the most important question in terms of the evaluation, does the NewsWise program improve the news literacy and or civic engagement of 9 to 11-year-olds? And what is the relationship between those two concepts? Just to give you a little bit of an insight into the methodological approach we took, we conducted a randomized control trial with an intervention group of 20 schools and a control group of 20 schools. We designed and administered pre-post surveys and a follow-up survey. We conducted also 14 focus groups with children who took NewsWise and 11 semi-structured interviews with teachers who delivered NewsWise. Let's just talk you through some of the baseline findings before I go into talking about the actual evaluation of whether of the program and whether it's effective or not. Let's just have a look at some of the baseline data that we really gathered from the project. 9 to 11-year-olds, so 86% of 9 to 11-year-olds believe that news stories should be truthful, which is promising. They believe that fake news is bad, 84%, great. Believe the news story should be balanced, but 62% believe that it's difficult to tell if information online is trustworthy, and not too many stop and check facts before believing the news. We also know that 9 to 11-year-olds can name, so 52% can name trustworthy places to find news, which is not very high. 52% find it easy to tell if a news story is real, again, not very high. Only 47% know how to spot fake news, and only 42% often read, watch, or listen to the news. So was NewsWise effective in increasing pupils' levels of news literacy? Yes, it was. For example, especially when we look at their ability to detect fake news based on the performance test, we can see that people in the intervention group, which basically is condition 1, so it's the blue line. Their ability to spot fake news considerably increased between time 1 and time 2. So between the first survey, the pre-survey, and the follow-up, and the post-survey, and equally between the post-survey and the follow-up survey. So these are encouraging, promising results. We also know from the quantitative evaluation that every single dimension of news literacy, in terms of how this was operationalized which includes three dimensions, really: attitudes towards, news reporting, ability to spot, an evaluation of information, and then understanding the broader news ecology, the news industry. Every single dimension of news literacy really correlates positively with the dimensions of, the civic engagement and its dimensions. Civic engagement was operationalized as including, again, attitudes around like a positive disposition and an attitude towards, civic responsibility, but then also like actual engagement in the present. We're conscious that we're talking here about young children, but things like community involvement, volunteering, taking part in activities for that are really in support of your own community. But also then the third dimension was around like your a positive disposition towards political participation when you grow up, so when you're going to be a grown-up. And we can see that there are interesting correlations between those dimensions. For example, between awareness, a dimension of civic engagement, and self-reported news evaluation. So perhaps because awareness of social political issues relies on engagement with news, right? Or another interesting strong correlation is, we found it between the positive attitudes that children have towards civic responsibility and their communities, and news attitudes, basically the attitudes that they have in terms of news trustworthiness, news reporting, and the extent to which they appreciate, quality, the quality when it comes to news reporting. I'm just going to end with a few insights that also emerged from the qualitative findings. By the end of the program, it was clear from the focus groups that pupils were more interested in the news and that they had developed a critical awareness of the news. And they very much also learned different strategies in terms of how to assess the trustworthiness of news stories. I remember having lots of conversations during those focus groups with children who enthusiastically were remarking on all the different things you can do. Look at the URL, check the photo, see if there are any typos, compare and contrast with different sources, all the different things that pupils eagerly had learned thanks to NewsWise. I'm not going to go through the quotes because I think I'm probably running out of time now, but I'm just really about to finish this. So it's just literally another minute or so. By the end of the program, pupils, as I said, learn different strategies. And then also teachers thought that NewsWise was helpful and that pupils liked it. And that's a very important finding, because you want to make sure that school programs are not just important and constructive, but also engaging and fun, right? Especially when you're dealing with, very young children. And they also felt adequately prepared. I mean, they had received some training from the Guardian Foundation. So it was reassuring to hear that. And we ultimately also found, through the focus groups, that there is indeed some, relationship between news literacy and civic engagement, in as much as pupils learned not just news literacy skills, but also developed their civic awareness through NewsWise and their positive disposition towards civic involvement. Here, for example, a student said, we should really know about the news because we need to know what's happening in our community. Or in another focus group, another pupil said, the NewsWise program makes me want to do different activities in our school. And it's really good to help your community by helping around the neighbors. So again, please look at the report if you want to know more about the kind of implications and the recommendations that we provided on the basis of the evaluation. But just to really wrap this up, 3 key takeaways. NewsWise can be utilized when designing new and/or making revisions to current news literacy programs. Primary school children in the UK have the potential to benefit from a program like NewsWise in terms of developing both news literacy and civic engagement. And the news and media literacy more broadly, and programs like NewsWise should be more firmly embedded in the school curriculum. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Franco. I'm going to dive in with a question. I'll just say before I do, I've dropped the links in the chat to the 3 sets of reports and the article as well. So if people want to find those, then the links are in the Zoom chat. And I know Pete will want to come in with a comment or a question in a minute. But before that, I'm really interested in that correlation question. And I think it's pertinent to lots of kind of digital literacy projects, media literacy projects around civic engagement or social cohesion, and then the digital literacy or media literacy correlation. Do you think it varies, or do you think one one is required for the other. I mean, in other words, we tend to assume with these projects that the literacy will have a positive impact on civic engagement or social cohesion, but then could it be that actually, in order for you to develop a critical literacy around these things, you actually need to have conditions which are socially cohesive or to already be civically engaged? What do you think about that relation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is complex, and it's not as straightforward as we would want it to be. It would be great to think that digital literacy will automatically, almost by default, serve as a catalyst for developing then civic competences and behavior in that realm. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, and as part of my own PhD, I looked at the relationship between the two concepts, but also the broader literature tells us that, people may well have the skills, but then decide not to deploy them. And there are bigger questions that are around, for example, also what it means to non-participate, because sometimes also non-participation can be a deliberate form of participation, if you will, especially if it's political in itself. So I think that just to say that we need to also complexify what we mean by participation and non-participation in a way. But then also, I think, to answer your question, I think it also depends on how we will understand digital literacy and the critical dimension of it particularly. Because if we are to understand it like like many would, and we do that also by drawing on aspects of that kind of work, like if we look at critical pedagogy, for example, and research that is aligned with that kind of school of thought, then the critical aspects of digital literacy really are about understanding power imbalances and asymmetries, and oftentimes that kind of way of approaching it can very much be intertwined with also issues around civic responsibility, civic action. And so you can see how, if you're looking at it from that particular perspective, perhaps it may be more likely that that there is more of an interaction between those two concepts, but but it's never guaranteed. I should probably say, yeah.
Thank you. Pete's put some comments in the chat. Pete Bennett. So Pete, do you want to frame a question or kind of summarize those in a comment verbally rather than Hi, Pete.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Gianfranco. Thanks very much for that. I'd be really interested in your perspective. I have my feelings that have been expressed in the chat. The problem is that in the UK, we've got a rather regressive curriculum. We've got a sort of 1950s notion of traditional literacy, and a lot of what, whenever you use that word embed, I just think how hard it is to get through that surface. That we are a country, and Julia and I were very close to this, who almost 3 or 4 years ago abolished media studies as a curriculum subject. I mean, literally came within 5 minutes. And as part of what apparently was a curriculum reform in order to better prepare us for the kind of digital age. And I wonder, it seems to me that the issue is what you're making all the time are very good points about premises of an effective critical education. And that's what we lack. This thing rubs against our desperate desire to be, which is why I really don't like the word, despite the fact I work at a university. We desperately want to be academic, where academic means at best stroke worst, being totally removed from the messinesses of, and we're scared to death in this country, as you're probably aware, of politics in schools. And all the stuff that you're doing, incredible. That final project is mind-blowingly bang on, that's entirely what. And I was just quoting Lefebvre, who talks about the critique of everyday life. I think that's what you're essentially engaging in. It's that, and education is about solving concrete problems. And I just wonder if you've got any advice for us.
I mean, I think I'm just going to echo a lot of what you just said, more than really adding something new. I agree pretty much with everything you said. I have, as part of my work, I've also looked at the school curriculum, and and I've looked at, and Julian and I have talked many times about this, and the fact, that the media literacy, unfortunately, yeah, is not really embedded in the curriculum, and what's happened with media studies is what it is, and it's unfortunate in a lot of ways. And as part of my work, I've spent some time looking at the ways in which different subjects can tap onto different aspects of digital literacy, which are important. The function of the critical. Think of subjects like computing, English, citizenship, ESG, but there is, in my view, there's still there isn't much in the curriculum, particularly around the broader digital environment, and really encouraging children to understand the business models of corporations, how the information that circulates, how that's produced, how it is commodified, issues of profit, algorithms, algorithmic bias, filter bubble. There has to be so much more about that, and that obviously links also very much with issues of misinformation. And if you are expecting children to develop the ability to be critical when it comes to consuming content, then there has to be the criticality also about the digital environment. And I think that isn't there. I've always been very skeptical also. I mean, not skeptical, but I think it's there's always that big question in our field, which is, do we want media literacy to be a subject of its own, or do we want to take a cross-curricular approach? Like you said, the irony is that there is a subject already out there that would do a great job of doing that, but unfortunately, this is not what's happening, and at the same time, you expect multiple subjects to do that job, but there is little coordination really, and I think the vision behind it is lacking in a lot of ways. When you talked about also politics in the curriculum and the fact that there is, I think that is also another big thing, and I think that's another tension. And I'm sorry, I don't think I will be able to resolve any of those tensions, but they are open questions, right? Because that's the tension between, do we want critical literacy, like digital literacy, media literacy, to serve those, political purposes? And that's a big question and a very valid one. And if so, is that something that should be reflected in the curriculum, or do we expect media literacy to promote critical autonomy, as in allowing students to be critical of information, and that can then align with different ideologies? These are big questions. And again, I'm sorry I can't provide you with any answers, really specific answers, but yeah, I think we could continue talking about this probably for hours and not find an answer.
Thank you. We have another question we've probably got time for, which is from Diane, who asks, with the NewsWise project, when you asked children to self-report on their news literacy and civic engagement, did they provide you with definitions and examples that made you as researchers rethink or recalibrate your frames?
Okay, just to clarify that in terms of so with NewsWise, as I said before, the instrument that we developed is not just based on self-reporting, but there was also a performance test that we developed. Specifically, children were asked to assess the veracity of news I think it was 12 news items, of which some were true and some had been fabricated intentionally, and to see whether they were able to recognize fake news, really. And precisely because we know that there are massive issues in the literature in terms of self-reporting and the bias that can come with that. Can you just repeat the second aspect of your question around whether there was some insight that came from children that helped us reframe our understanding?
Yeah, sure. But Diane, do you want to ask it yourself, as we don't have a huge amount of questions? If you're able to or not, I can repeat it.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Gianfranco. Very interesting, this set of projects that you've been doing. I'm just quite interested with the children's one, that having taught children's film and media as a subject area. There is this sort of ongoing debate about in research, sort of basically involving the children in their sort of interpretations as to what is at stake. So actually giving the child the voice to also, in some ways, I suppose, therefore, that hence my question, sort of construct the frame. Often it's the case that adults come in and they have these ideas as to what citizenship is, what news literacy should be, right? And therefore I think it's just it's as much as that, I suppose, an ethics question, but also in terms of how you engage kids, right? In terms of what adults as researchers and producers of material, having sort of listened to producers of children's material as well, you know, how you engage their interests, that they feel as though you're actually taking them seriously in that way, right? And I wondered if you'd come across, hence why I was focusing on the self-reporting, the sort of interaction that you'd had, and where you'd ask their sort of their sort of processes. That's the bit that I was sort of honing in on.
Yeah, 2 points in response to that. Thank you for your question, Jan, which is a great question. The project would have had to be, should have been much more participatory in order to do exactly what you're talking about. So I'm afraid that the answer is probably no to some extent, but yes in others, and I'll unpack that very soon. I'm completely with you in terms of the importance of making sure that there is participatory research that is conducted very much in the realm of like media, news literacy, education, so as not to impose our own definitions of what news literacy is and why it matters and what aspects should be crucial to news literacy, but really to listen to the voices of students and pupils themselves, and then to make sure that we design programs and a curriculum that really meets those needs. And Julian and myself we can't say too much about it, but we are sort of working on something that really resonates with this idea right now as an idea for the future, for future research. So that's one thing. But in terms of some things that really stood out from the fieldwork that sort of like challenged in a way or helped us reframe our thinking around certain things, yes, by all means, you know, the voices of children were, you know, even though the project wasn't in itself participatory, the voice we did all we could to really make sure that we would amplify those voices, and we really, you know, through the focus groups and really allow children to voice their concerns and you know, some of the things that I remember top of my head that really stayed with me, for example, and that really allowed me to think, oh, you know, I wasn't thinking like that before this project. One is, for example, the assumption that I think as adults and myself I had before this project, which is like, you know, children that age are not going to be interested in the news. They're not going to care just as much as we do. I was so pleasantly surprised that I was so wrong, because during the focus groups, children really showed a level of enthusiasm about the news and wanting to stay informed and understanding what's going on in their communities, and also how the news can affect their mood, and the war in Ukraine, and how that had an impact on you know, on how they felt, or the conversations they were having in the house. All of that really, really surprised me, which made me think, again, we tend to have oftentimes assumptions that are not very helpful. And also another assumption I had, which I myself as a researcher had to challenge through NewsWise, was the fact that I thought that in some ways, you know, talking about misinformation and spotting misinformation and fake news and perhaps would have been a little bit too complicated for 9 to 11-year-olds. And I was again very surprised, because they were so enthusiastic and so eloquent and well-spoken during those focus groups. And I think that surely NewsWise gave them, you know, an opportunity to also develop a language around this, but they surely had a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm that I perhaps had, you know, not accounted for fully before this project. So I hope this answers your question, Leon. Thanks.